My name is Mary Abley, and I'm the pastor, and we are so delighted to be hosting this series, Robotics and Humanity. And it's done in conjunction with All Souls, with the Shelburne Museum, and Shelburne Farms. So we're very pleased to have you all here, and I'd like to introduce you to Tom Denenberg, who is the new director of the Shelburne Museum.
Thank you. I've just been sort of, all this space. I think we're getting a little promiscuous with superlatives in American culture. But this is a profoundly beautiful space with an absolutely awe-inspiring view. So thank you, Mary. Thank you, All Souls, for sharing us this space with the farms and with the museum for this series. As Mary said, the farms, the museum, and All Souls Interfaith Gathering came together to sponsor this three-part lecture series this spring that is in advance of an exhibition at the museum this summer called Time Machines, Robots, Rockets, and Steampunk. Our series this spring, Robotics and Humanity, Conversations in Technology, Spirit, and Art, could not have a better home, I think, for the latter part of that sentence. And our series asks, what does technology teach us about humanity? What do we see of ourselves reflected in the mechanical and technological world that we create? Fran Stoddard, who of course is moderating the conversation today, needs very little introduction, and she will be working with our guest speakers who are investigating robotics, technology, artificial intelligence, creativity, and the intersections of technology and social interaction. Stoddard, of course, is the host of Vermont Public Television's very popular profile program and will be with us for the next two Wednesdays as well, and leading off. And she will introduce our panelists and get us going with this very exciting series. So thank you all for coming and participating. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Tom, and Mary, and Shelburne Farms. This is I am so delighted to be back here and talking with two brilliant men, so I will introduce them right away and we'll get on in our conversation. Last fall, multi-degreed UVM professor and researcher Dr. Josh Bongard won a Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers that included a $500,000, that's a $500,000 research grant for his work with self-evolving robots. He has advanced degrees from Canada, the UK, and Switzerland. He has worked on the Golem and self-replicating projects at Cornell, which we'll get into a little bit. It's wonderful that you're here at UVM, and welcome here today.
Thanks very much.
On the other side, we have Robert Geraci. He is an associate professor of religious studies at Manhattan College in New York City and the author of Apocolyptic AI. And for those of you that might not know what that is, it's artificial intelligence. It might come up again today. Visions of Heaven in Robotics, Artificial Intelligence, and Virtual Reality. Dr. Geraci has investigated that edge between science and religion for some time, and particularly the intersection of virtual worlds and religion. So welcome to Vermont and coming here. It's great he brought his whole family up. So this is when I heard this topic, I went, whoa, hopefully I can be here. I am not a scientist. I'm sure that there are a number of you here in the audience, but we're going to try to keep this to a lay level. But this intersection and where this is going, we are at the dawn of this robotic age. They are upon us. We're intrigued by them. We have been for millennium, actually, all the way from the Golem through Frankenstein and the Terminator and Blade Runner. This whole concept obviously intrigues us as human beings, and we're going to look at how it affects our psyche, our beliefs, and how they make us feel about our place as human beings in the world. So off we go. Robert, I'll start with you. Artificial intelligence, gaming, and robotics seem so far removed from spiritual pursuits. So I just have to ask you, what called you, a person with these Renaissance interests in the sciences, but arts and literature, to investigate technology and virtual worlds in connection with religion?
Well, technology in general is a way in which we reshape the world we live in. It's, technology broadly, not just digital technologies. We reshape the world, we try to fabricate the world in the image we want it to have and invest meaning in it. in the way we rebuild it. And so technology, for me, is already religious. It's already about meaning, and it's already about the world in which we want to live. And then it just happens to be that technologies like robots are very cool.
Okay, we will return to that. Josh, now you, through most of your academic career, have been attempting to replicate natural evolution in a virtual world.
That's right.
In a computer.
That's correct.
So what have you learned about evolution through computation? I mean, what has it told you about?
It's told me a lot, and maybe just to sort of paint a picture of this idea of what we do. For those of you who aren't familiar with my research, if you imagine a virtual world or a video game, rather than building robots by hand, what we do is we fill this virtual space with virtual critters that run around. So we've got our virtual robots running around inside a virtual world that's running on a supercomputer at the University of Vermont. And then we add computer programs on top that simulate biological evolution. The computer reaches in and selects some of the robots to reproduce, and it selects other robots to cull them out of the population. And it does this based on that we want a robot to do a particular task. And so we evolve these robots over time. And as you mentioned, there's sort of two aims for us. One of them is an engineering aim, where we're trying to evolve these virtual robots and then hopefully manufacture them as physical robots, and they do useful work for us. They're a new kind of technology in our world, but they also have a scientific aim, which they tell us something about evolution. And one of the things we've learned is that at least for simple creatures, evolution works quite well. We often find robots evolving in these virtual worlds that look nothing like something you'd find in biology, or they solve the task in a way we hadn't expected, and in some way it's a very creative process. Somehow evolution finds a solution to our problem, and it's often not what we had anticipated.
Right, so in other words, you're creating things that have not been created before.
That's correct.
Because we create most robots in our own image.
In our own image, or in the image of familiar animals.
Right. By the way, I just have to say, so Josh ran 5,000, I think I've got this right, simulations, each taking 30 hours on parallel processors at UVM, a computation that would have taken 50 or 100 years on a single machine. So just sit with that for a minute. He's taken up a lot of computer space up there. But pretty interesting and cool thing. So, here's this question that was like, do I do this last or do I ask it right away? I'm going to ask it right away of both of you. Will we be able to create robots that not only evolve and learn with little human intervention, but eventually become sentient and as intelligent or more intelligent than we are? That's the fantasy. How do you, as scientists right there, feel that this is a reality, and about when? So, Robert, you weren't confused, are you?
No. I believe we will have some really sophisticated machines, some of which we might come to treat as though they are in particular ways sentient. If you look at people who are aficionados of the Sony Aibo robot dog, which got discontinued, but it was a robot dog and it was about this big, and the people who bought Sony's, well, they either put it in the closet after a week and a half, or they fell in love with it, and they continue to use them, and there was a great uproar when Sony discontinued the product. So, and it's not as good as a real dog. You know, in terms of being a dog. It's very cool in terms of being a robot dog, and it's not very cool in terms of being an actual dog. But people impart a lot of emotion and feeling into those kinds of robots. And I don't see any reason why, as technology improves, we won't continue to do that. When you start talking about whether robots will ever be sentient or as intelligent as we are, it seems to me that machines will be intelligent in different ways than we are. They have different, seemingly different capacities. But one of their capacities, unfortunately, is also that they break down a lot easier than we do. And I could easily envision, someone starting the first really, truly sentient machine and having a software failure within 30 seconds, that nobody can figure out what the software failure is, because the code would be so enormously complicated that even the other machines probably couldn't figure out why it doesn't work. So I'm personally a little skeptical on the sentient machine, but I wouldn't rule it out.
That's interesting. This is a question I often get asked. When
Sure.
will we have intelligent robots or sentient robots or conscious robots? And all of those terms, consciousness, intelligence, sentience, it's interesting to think about what do we actually mean by those terms. How would we know whether we had an intelligent robot or a conscious robot? Robert was mentioning that we project a lot of our ideas onto Sony Aibos and robots and pets and animals and other humans. Just the other day I was at Stowe Elementary School showing some grade 5ers our evolving robots in the simulation. So they're watching this computer and to them it looks like a video game and it's evolving and they're shouting out, that one's afraid of the light and that one's frustrated and that one's given up and that one's tripped and it refuses to play anymore. We naturally project. And then last week I had a colleague from the Salk Institute, a very eminent neuroscience, who also watched the video and said, that robot's tipping over and that robot's afraid and that robot, we all do it. We can't help but to project our ideas about what is happening, what is the internal state of this robot, this animal, this human. So intelligence and consciousness is very much in the eye of the beholder, and whether someday we make very complex robots and we choose to view them or label them as intelligent is a matter of personal preference, I would say.
Well, there's this whole thing, like, do people love or fear robots? And, you go one side or the other. Some people are very afraid of what they, I think, could be. And some people just love the idea of robots. Is there, I guess I don't really have it's a question that just came up as I was sitting here and with somebody, what is that all about? Should we fear robots, or should we love them and not worry that they will take over and as perhaps in Terminator, one of the Terminator movies, and go beyond us?
I'm a both kind of person. Not only do I think most of us, we see danger and salvation at the same time in robots. You can look at industrial robots, factory robots, say, look, it took a boring, awful, dangerous job away from another human being, or away from human beings, and that's great. But it also meant those human beings, now they're unemployed, right? So, those two things go, kind of hand in hand. Someone asked me, I was guest speaking the other day in at another college in a class, and someone asked me about deep sea robots. And the extension of our vision and our knowledge and how fantastic and amazing it is that, we can now go places that we couldn't go before. And I said, yeah, isn't that amazing? And it also means we can drop bombs on people without having to go anywhere at all. And so, on the one hand, that power, that extension is this wonderful extension of what it means to be human, that we can learn and know. But it also, it allows us to express some of our less pleasant characteristics also, and I think we need to choose. If we choose to love, perhaps then we would choose to learn things rather than blow things up.
Right. The love-hate relationship with robots is also very cultural. If you look at most of the Hollywood movies, the robot is usually a bad guy or girl, most of the time. But in Japan, most of the movies, the robot is a good guy or a girl. It really depends, and robots somehow best personifies our fear and our hopes for technology. It's literally technology made in human form, and that's something that seems to speak to us and leads to a love-hate relationship with this particular kind of technology.
I'm going to address this to you, Robert, which this whole theory or myth of evolution, natural selection, claims that we will continue to adapt and advance our species. Evolution eventually could lead to the apocalyptic scenarios that you study. In AI, this artificial intelligence, apocalyptic movement is an event called the singularity. Could you explain that concept so we can just discuss it a little bit?
I would like to point out that I don't think natural selection applies to robots. A lot of people say it does, and that robots are evolving we're evolving into robots and that kind of thing. I don't know what the selection pressures would be in the world of evolution that would quite work that, but I get that, you know, we're producing new robots and they change all the time. The singularity is the belief that as we continue to improve the technologies that we're building, that they are improving at ever more rapid pace, right? That, you know, we all see this in our cell phones and our computers, buy a new one in 2 years, and it's gonna be a heck of a lot better than the one you bought 2 years ago. So that creates a growth curve, right? And if that continues, where things roughly get twice as good every 18 months, every 2 years, then the growth curve goes kind of like this. And eventually, somewhere around here, we can't predict what's going to happen in the future. So the singularity is that point beyond which we cannot predict. It's the, oh, I kind of know what life will look like in 5 years. I kind of know what life will look like in 10 years. But if the singularity happens, I have no idea what life will look like anymore. And there are all kinds of claims about what that might mean for us technologically.
And some think it's going to lead to our ultimate demise, and some think it's our salvation and this purification piece. Do you lie on one side or the other about what that moment could be? Because you know, there's a group that goes there, that this is, you know, well, what I read is that when it comes to thinking about apocalyptic theology, Christianity comes in first, but roboticists and artificial intelligence researchers have risen to second place. So when we think about these things, that's where we stand. So is there, you know, is it our ultimate demise or salvation, or why do people go there? What's that about?
It has a lot to do with the baggage you bring to that conversation. For a Christian, the apocalypse is the moment at which the world ends, and God creates a new world. That's a short, simple, kind of easy Christian apocalypse, right? World ends, God makes a new world, we get to live in it forever and ever, and we're happy. The kind of AI apocalypse, instead of having God create a new world, instead technology creates a new world, and maybe we get to live in it and be happy forever. And usually that amounts to, could we copy our minds into robots? And if we can copy our minds into robots, would that constitute immortality for any one of us who would then get to be a robot forever? You asked me where I lay on that spectrum. Yes, there are a growing number of organizations and a growing number of adherents who believe that the technology really is improving at that kind of rate, and it really is producing this, going to produce this amazing new world that human beings, as we all are, have no place in, and that we will either upload our minds into robots and live forever, or we will die out as a species.
There are people that believe very seriously in this. It's quite something. But
you know, so you asked me, but I don't know that I buy into the singularity hypothesis to begin with, so I don't really, I mean, and I also don't know that I would feel it was really very consoling if a robot version of me was going to live on after I die. You know, I mean, I'm still dying in that scenario, and I mean, my wife may or may not like that idea, but I don't know that it does anything for me.
Well, this is very interesting. And so we'll come back to that. But Josh, you talk about actually the limitations of computation to create these complex systems that we imagine, I think, on many levels. And you've seen that the system runs out of gas, as you say, after a while. What do you conjecture is missing in your attempt to kind of recreate evolution?
So that's a good question. Actually, I remember as a kid, I read a book by Hans Moravec, who was an MIT roboticist, and he was the first one, I think, to propose this idea of uploading our minds into robot bodies and all the rest of it. And that was very inspirational to me at the time, not necessarily that I wanted that to have happened to me, but that there was at least no theoretical reason why we couldn't do that. If you take, faster than light travel, there are seemingly theoretical limitations there, but with enough improvement in technology, it seems that might be something we could actually do, is to upload ourselves into robotics. And that was one of the things that, just that question of whether we could was something that got me into robotics in the first place. And eventually into this field of evolutionary robotics, where we use ideas from evolution. And as you mentioned, though, in our research, we see that we're able to evolve more and more complex robots, but like you say, they eventually run out of gas. We're seeming to reach this complexity ceiling where we have robots that can run around and they can recognize and pick up red objects and avoid blue objects and do sorts of things you might see simple animals doing. But we're not able to push beyond that barrier, and that's kind of where our research is. So in my lab, we ask questions like, is this just not the right approach? Or is there some secret piece of evolution that we're missing? So are we not building in all the pieces of evolution? Or were robots just never meant to be more complex? Maybe, ever greater levels of complexity is something that's specific to carbon-based life forms and is not appropriate for silicon-based life forms. That's where the research is for us.
Yeah.
Why can we only get so far?
Right. Well, yeah, what is that spark that creates biological evolution, but you can't recreate that consciousness or self-awareness?
Sure. I mean, you mentioned that, we run 50 years worth of computations, but Mother Nature took much more than 50 years to produce us. Is it just a matter of time, or is there something fundamental that we're missing?
Yeah, that soul question. Do you still have faith that you would be able to build a robot with human-level intelligence?
I do, and that's part of why I do what I do. I think, we are incredibly miraculous beings, and we are very complex. But as a scientist, I haven't seen any evidence yet to convince me that there's something in us that cannot necessarily be replicated in technology. I don't see any hard evidence for why we couldn't someday produce robots that exhibit human levels of intelligence or even beyond.
Robert, Carl Jung and then consequently Joseph Campbell identified apocalyptic theories as universal in myth and stories of the world, including world religions, the myth of Gollum and Frankenstein we talked about before. I'm wondering what impact apocalyptic artificial intelligence theology, amazing kind of term, is having on the real world. There's an impact that AI is having an impact on the real world now. What is that, and what are you noticing, and how is it changing us in the way we think?
The impact is extraordinary, and it goes across a wide array of kind of cultural domains. What was, Hans Moravec, it was in 1978 he wrote his first article about uploading minds into robots, and his first book was in 1988. And when Hans Moravec wrote that book, it was this complete outlier in the world of popular science. It was the first book that claimed to not be science fiction, that said things like, we'll have super intelligent robots that we're all going to upload our minds into. I mean, it was a landmark book. And at the time, it seemed very strange, I guess, though inspiring, which was part of his initiative in writing the book. Can he inspire people to become scientists? And one of the things that emerged out of this is that he's acknowledged it was also designed to inspire people with money to invest money in robotics and artificial intelligence. That's an accepted part of that package for him. And now it's really remarkable. Some of the advocates for these beliefs, they work for the National Science Foundation, they speak in front of Congress. Ray Kurzweil, who most of his ideas come from Hans Moravec and a couple of others, but he is himself a very brilliant inventor and really the champion right now of all the mind uploading and the rest of it. And Kurzweil started a school And he gets people to come to his school. He gets CEOs to come to his school. He gets public policy people to come to his school.
They want to upload their minds. Perhaps.
Well, what they end up doing is they end up kind of working on global challenges, global problems with younger student people. And then they get venture capitalists to show up. And then they start talking about the businesses that can come out of their 9-week classes or whatever. So, I mean, in that sense, it's actually hugely important. Because it's launching real businesses who are being funded to go out and, you know, some of these, they're not really about uploading minds. They're about building cheap, easy houses for people in, say, hurricane-ravaged areas, right? So it's a bigger picture than just can you upload your mind. But the premise of the school is Kurzweil, his book, The Singularity is Near, is the textbook of the school. And the belief that technology is improving that rapidly, and we all just have to kind of push forward. And so we see it in government, we see it in business. Obviously, it's present in places like science fiction still. There are lots of stories and so forth where people continue to do this kind of thing.
So just to finish this thought, I don't mean to be flip, but why would someone want to upload one's mind into, I guess there is the live forever piece, or what's the drive there?
It's live forever, but it's also live better. Most of the advocates speak in terms of all the things they could learn, all the things they could know. One of the more bizarre comments that Hans Moravec says is that the worst aspect of personal death is the wanton loss of information, which somehow I wonder how anyone who is Hans Moravec's age could have not experienced enough death that he would think the worst thing about death is that some information gets lost. As opposed to, you know, all the love and the relationships, you know, it's a little strange, but for him, he wants to know more and learn more, and that's one of the driving factors for a lot of the people who, you know, speak in terms of, they also speak in terms of being happy all the time. Why be sad if you're a robot? You could just go do science all the time and be happy. Right? So they really envision a future in a kind of post-apocalyptic future. We're all going to be happy. We're all going to live forever. We're all going to be scientists. It's going to be awesome.
It won't be messy. Well, messy human stuff.
Where do I sign up?
So Beck, you see you know, when I was first looking at the brilliance that I have sitting across from me, going back and forth between an apocalyptic future and the beginnings of evolution and recreating evolution, the joining was pretty interesting. But I'm going to keep going back and forth. I hope it doesn't feel too staccato. And I'm going to also, you know, please either take notation or keep those questions in the back of your mind, because I will open this up in a minute. So back to Josh, I'm wondering the difference between virtual robots and real-world robots. So you're in a virtual world, and you might have seen this poster. This is the real world.
I apologize, I couldn't bring the starfish along with me today.
A real-world robot that was created from, okay, we'll take these models that we've done online, make a real-world robot. One, why did you make it, and what happened when you started using this real world? What's the difference between both, and what have you learned from each?
Right. So again, one of our goals is ultimately to build useful technology. So all of our virtual evolving robots, every once in a while we sit down and actually build a physical version. The reason why we built this particular one was to study one of the hallmarks of biological intelligence, which is the idea of resiliency. So for our poor robot here, it evolves the ability to run around, and once it masters this task, we sent a graduate student in with a screwdriver, and it pulled off one of the robot's legs. And as any of you who have a car or a computer know, when a technology breaks, it usually stays broken until somebody fixes it. But in the case of our resilient machine, the starfish, it gradually learns that now it has 3 legs rather than 4, and gradually evolves or learns the ability to keep moving again. And you can imagine the reporters love to compare this to the Terminator and all those other yeah, the ever-ready battery, the bunny rabbit and all that sort of thing, right? It just keeps on going.
Right.
So again, that was one of the reasons why we built the physical robot, is robots or technology are going to have to ultimately survive and work alongside us here in the real world. And the real world is, at least until the singularity, a messy place, a dangerous place. Things are always changing. You need to adapt, and humans and animals are very good at that. And our technology, at least not yet, is not very good at that.
What challenges have you experienced with your robotic creations? I mean, did totally unexpected things happen, or did you pretty much figure out that they would figure out how to kind of stumble along? It's pretty interesting. You can go online and see these guys moving around.
Sure, yeah, you can.
and getting better at what they need to do.
That's right. Well, this particular robot, the first thing it did is we gave it the command that it should explore. It should try out different movements of its body and try and learn about what has happened. And so the first thing it did, it said, okay, if my goal is to learn what to do, I should do the most extreme possible action and gain the most information that I can. So it did a double flipped and pulled itself out of the wall socket, lost all power, and shut itself off. So as Robert mentioned, most robots will find a way to turn themselves off within about 30 seconds. And we know, from an evolutionary point of view, what Mother Nature does with those kinds of solutions. So that robot went by the wayside and was eventually replaced with this robot that learned that curiosity is not just try the craziest thing you can possibly imagine, but start with gentle things, rock back and forth, extend an arm, pull it back. And it for us as well, when it first started doing that, it was pretty creepy. It looks like something that's gradually learning and so on. And so those parts of our mind that project agency or project a soul or consciousness or curiosity onto other things was going crazy. It looks like it's learning and that it's hesitant.
Caution?
That it's
learning caution.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. So
That's...
it's fun. It's an interesting thing to pursue.
So back to Robert. What motivates us, as you know, from religious studies? What motivates us to create robots in the first place? We've been thinking about them since Gollum and before that. What is so fascinating to us about this? And why is Josh doing this work?
Well, he may be just doing this work because he's trying to solve some actual real-world problems.
Sure.
That's part of it. Yeah.
In terms of our sort of spiritual, psychological makeup, it is the case that we see life around us, and it's an amazing and incredible thing. And if you look at sort of the Western, just strictly staying in the Western religious trajectory, the greatest thing that the gods did, was to make the world and to make us as the most wonderful thing in the world. And so we have a long tradition of, well, how can we copy that? And if you look, you mentioned the golem. If you look at, say, the ancient, the earliest Jewish writings on the golem, there's the assumption that a truly righteous man could actually create a whole new world. Because someone who was truly and utterly righteous would be one with God. And being one with God would mean being one with God's greatest power, which is the power of creation. And so you'd be able to create your own world. But since we're all, to greater or lesser extent, not righteous, we can't really do that. But in that golem tradition, the people who could create golems, these walking, early it was actually some of the golems were animals, but animals or people who walk along and have life, that's reflective of our desire to have the greatest power imaginable. Can we really make things that are alive? And if we can make living things, can we make them so cool that they're like us? And we do have that, that millennia-long aspiration to share in that power of creation. Whether that's why people invented robots in the 20th century, I don't know, but it certainly fits very nicely in that narrative.
Well, speaking of two things. Humans have always been fascinated with this and based our tools on biology, what we do. Our original robots were based on biology and kind of looked like people or did things that we do. And, you're coming from a very different place. You are not interested in that. I mean, how do you get away from that anthropomorphic piece where you don't want to start there? You want to start from zero and see what happens, kind of how things evolve mechanically, right?
Right, so that's a big motivation for myself and a lot of other of my colleagues in robotics. And like you asked before, why do we do what we do? For some of us, it's the engineering motivation to make technology, but for myself, it was the curiosity, the scientific motivation, which is that we are very mysterious still. We know a lot about the outer reaches of the galaxy and the universe, and we can now see subatomic particles. So the very big and the very small, we're starting to get a very good handle on. But there's this catch-22, which is the organ we use to see those things is the organ or the thing that is least understood, is the most mysterious. So part of my motivation is to understand the mind, the brain, the human body, adaptive behavior. And so we can do that partly with robotics by trying to build robots that are models or reflections of humans or animals. That's usually known as biorobotics. You're copying a biological organism. But as you mentioned, what we do is slightly different, which is evolutionary robotics, where we want to try and understand why did evolution produce us in the first place. So one of the sort of games we play with our experimental platforms is, in essence, sort of rewind the evolutionary tape. So rather than starting with a four-legged robot and evolve from there, we try and make very few assumptions about what kind of robots are going to evolve in our virtual worlds. And sometimes when we run evolution, we get things that have 4 legs, and we run it again and we get 4 legs again, and then we run it a third time and we get something completely different, right? What would evolution do if we rewind the tape? So one of the applications of this is sort of what sorts of intelligent entities will nature produce given the chance to do it again.
And it seems in biology, brains and bodies evolved together.
That's right.
And when it comes to robotics, they're fairly separated, or at least they have been.
That's right.
So no, in a way, you're trying to combine those, again, start from this very elemental place.
That's right. So René Descartes, a philosopher, sort of argued that the soul and the body are different, and now we might say the mind and the body are different, but from Mother Nature's point of view, they are part and parcel of the same thing. So in robotics, you often see roboticists saying, well, we understand bodies and we understand physiology, so build a robot dog or build a humanoid robot, and we're going to focus all of our attention on the brain because the brain is the seat of intelligence and the most mysterious. That's where we should be focusing all our efforts. Whereas from an evolutionary point of view, the mystery is how did brains and bodies and opposable thumbs and cerebral cortexes and our eyes all evolve together.
Sit with that for a minute. And back to Robert. Talking about virtual worlds, which is something you've studied, Second Life, which is people, I mean, if you haven't heard of this, I hadn't heard of this till just a few years ago, and people kind of live whole lives inside a computer. They have an avatar, someone who represents them that can go and shop at a store, or go to IBM, or visit people and have romances. I mean, it is quite deep and unbelievable, and to me, I've only seen a little bit of it, and I think it was Warcraft is another one that you studied. How does the virtual world help people? Why do they go there? How does it help us understand our world and who and what we are, or our inherent nature, or does it? You know, why do some people, you spend hours and hours and hours in these virtual worlds?
Well, you have to start with the fact that these kinds of virtual worlds are not the first kinds of virtual worlds, and that, you know, for example, I grew up reading an awful lot of books. I laid in my room and I read books, and in those books I was part of some other kind of world. You know, there are old churches, you walk into them and you have maybe the story of, you know, Jesus's passion on all the walls. And those kinds of places, they create worlds for us to inhabit, right? We got lots of technologies for producing virtual worlds. It just so happens that computers produce some really compelling ones now. So as to why people spend so much time in there, I think a lot of it has to do with their pursuit of meaning and the ways in which they can fulfill themselves in those virtual worlds, as opposed to the way many people, for example, feel about their jobs. Many people work their jobs, and I'm fortunate to not be one of them. I love my job. But I know many people who go to work every day because that's how they get money to pay their mortgages or their rents, you know, to buy food for their kids. It's not because they like those jobs. It's because that's the job. Those are the jobs they do. And if you spent 9 hours of your day doing a job that you didn't really like, and that you may not even feel on the back end you got anything really great out of, you know, that you didn't produce anything really beautiful, you didn't save anyone's life, you know, then you can come home and you get into World of Warcraft, and all your friends are there, right? They all log on at the same time, so you can chat with each other, or you can use a microphone and you can talk to them, and you can go do really meaningful stuff, like save the world. And after you've saved the world, all the computer non-player characters in the world, they all look at you and they say, wow, thanks. That was terrific. You are our savior. You know, and is it any wonder that after a couple hours of that, you're hanging out with your friends. Almost nobody plays these games by themselves. The stereotypical, you know, loner in a basement who, you know, is 45 and doesn't have a job or something, that person doesn't exist. There are like 3 of them. Most of the people who play these games, they play with their friends, they play with their family. They list playing with friends and family as the single most important reason why they play those games. And so they play with their friends and family, and they get to feel like they're doing real work, work that matters to them. And then afterwards, okay, I go to bed having defeated the evil Lich King, and that was awesome. You know, and that's you know, for a lot of people, that's going to feel a lot better than going to bed saying, well, you know, I did my thing again for, you know, 9 hours. We built widgets or whatever, you know, we were going to do. You know, not everybody enjoys his or her job immensely. And this is an opportunity to really enjoy life and to do things that you couldn't otherwise do.
This is great stuff. And I'm gonna toss it. Well, one, both of these. I have a few more questions, but I think I've had my say here. So, one, you might have questions of each other, because clearly we're talking very different, very elemental. And actually, I will. Sorry, Josh. I will ask one more question of you. But where does this take you spiritually? This work that. Or does it?
I'm a scientist. I'm an atheist. So in terms of spiritually, I believe in science. I've chosen to dedicate my life to it. And the meaning that I extract from my job is that I can see these things evolving, and people attribute intelligence or curiosity or consciousness to these things. And it makes me, and it makes the people that are saying this, think differently about human nature. What does it really mean to be intelligent? How do I know that you're intelligent? And it's exploring those questions. I guess it's a thrilling experience to be a part of that and to be creating the technologies that cause people to start those conversations. And that, I guess, fulfills me in a spiritual way. It's an enjoyment beyond just the science of it. And that's a big draw for me for what I do.
Thank you. I'd like to throw it out, and you guys can also contemplate a question for each other. But yes, all the way in the back, in the pink. No, one behind you and then you. Yes.
I want to speak to the issue that you touched on earlier about the qualities that we project onto robots. And I'm wondering, what qualities do you identify to imbue with the robots? What do you, because you have to create their ability to move, their ability to think, their ability to feel. Do you put the emotion into the robot, and what qualities, because you spoke to it as being cultural. You know, what Westerners perceive as the aspect of the human may be different from what Eastern religions or philosophies consider. Right. So I'm wondering what you would imbue in the robots.
Right. Well, when we do our experiments, as I mentioned, from an evolutionary point of view, we're basically breeding these robots very much like you might breed animals on a farm. And so we're usually selecting for traits that are behavioral. We want a robot that runs quickly or is able to distinguish between dangerous situations and safe situations. So we as scientists are imposing the kinds of behaviors we want the robots to perform, but the way that the computer evolves the robots to perform those tasks is sort of up to the computer, is up to the blind chance of evolution. And so often the way that the robot fulfills these goals that we set for them seem to have an emotional content to them. So I gave you the example of the robot that's sort of curious, that rocks back and forth and looks hesitant. Other times we rerun it and the robot looks very aggressive. It will stand up and start running as quickly as it can in a certain direction. And so again, that's sort of the interesting thing. We're asking for objective, solid behaviors, things that you can define, but it looks like it has an emotional content or an intelligent aspect to it, and that's not something we've programmed in.
And there are other kinds of behaviors. I mean, if you give a robot a camera such that it recognizes faces, right? And if your personal robot in your home recognizes you, your spouse, your kids, and then it behaves differently to you than it does to other people who show up, that's one of our moments where we start putting the values in there. Oh, that robot knows me and it likes me, right? It does different things for me than it does for the stranger who just came into my house, right? And that shows that it likes me. And I mean, that's just us doing our thing, right? Like, oh, it likes me, but does the word like really make sense for what that robot is doing? I don't know, but we do that. And so it's not just like that's right. How it runs, but almost anything that you could have the robot do, and there are more social things and less social things. Things like seeing you and saying good afternoon are very social, and those are great opportunities for us to feel like the robots like us.
Right. And I think it's those experiences when that happens. It says much more about us than it does about the robots.
I think of Star Trek's Data always wanting that emotional chip, and it was like he was the guy that had it all along or something. Right. Yes, sir.
Let me take that question a little bit further, because you almost stole it from me. Brain science has taken us to this extent that we know now that as much as we like to think we're rational, we really are primarily first emotional. And that everything we do has an emotional component, whether we can't deny it, we do deny it in the real world, but it doesn't work that way. It would seem to me that if you're really going to build intelligence into something, and now I'm taking the opposite route than you did, if I may clear, Josh.
Yep, sure.
In that going from a human to the robot rather than robot to a brand new concept. But if you're really going to incorporate intelligence into something, you might try out mimicking that emotional being first.
Sure.
But then you get into the how complex of what is it, 2000, whatever.
2000. Wow.
So I don't really have anything to say about it, but I'm observing.
Well, just a disclaimer, there are some neuroscientists here in the audience, so I'm going to hedge I'm going to be very circumspect in my comments, but of course, emotion is a component of human intelligence, and in the way that we love to attribute intelligence or this computer, this robot knows me, we also self-label, right? I made that decision because I realized that would be better for me. We have wonderful explanations for why we did things, and modern psychological research and neuroscience research is saying that's absolutely not the case. We made that decision for some other reason that was influenced by our emotions or what we had for lunch, not this rational, cold judgment that we like to attribute to ourselves.
Well, yes.
You both mentioned some of the real-world problems that building robots could solve or begin to solve. Can you talk a little bit about some of the coolest potential solutions
can give it a go. It's always very difficult to try and predict what the killer app of a new technology is, email or Twitter. So any guess we make is sure to be wrong. But industrial robots has already shown us that inside a factory, we can build things on a much larger scale, more cost effectively than we can by hand. And I think if we are able to make autonomous robots, or robots that can do things on their own, that can adapt in the real world, they'll have a similar use. They'll allow us to build things outside on a large scale in a cost-effective manner compared to doing it by hand. You know, there's a lot of discussion now about alternative energy, that if we covered half of Texas in solar panels, we'd solve the world energy problems. So why don't we do it? Because it's too expensive, right? So I think one of the applications that we're already seeing is robotic technology in the smart grid, the smarter planet, smarter infrastructure. We might not have humanoid robots walking around welding things outside, but the technologies that we're deploying outdoors have an increasingly robotic or autonomous capability. I think that's going to be, that area is going to be where a lot of the killer apps happen.
I'd like to point out that covering half of Texas with solar panels would be a terrible idea. There are some other value, there's more value in Texas than merely solar power. But in terms of what would be really cool and fascinating for me personally would be to see some of the urban search and rescue kind of robots improved. I had the good fortune of spending a summer at Carnegie Mellon, and the Robotics Institute there is absolutely phenomenal, and I met a bunch of wonderful people doing really cool stuff. Snake robots that climb up poles, and you know, I mean, you think about what a snake could do theoretically for finding people in some sort of tragic circumstance, right? A building collapse and an earthquake, for example, and you deploy your snake robots, and the snake robots all talk to each other, and they all go slithering in through the building, and then they radio back the rest of us and tell us, here's where there are still survivors who can be helped. You know, and that, you know, that would be pretty amazing. That would also be really distressing if they radioed back and said, there are survivors here and you can't help them. That would be crushing news. You know, you can only imagine the sort of trauma for the person who hears that news. Not to mention the person who's actually trapped. But the ability to save people, I think, is a really amazing and wonderful thing, and really the kind of thing that we should push for, you know, as a public. I mean, it's not just about people who build robots, we're a public. And what do we want robots to do? We want them to save people's lives. We want them to build certain things that, you know, human beings aren't good at building, but that we need, you know. That would be a remarkable feat. But that's a human feat for us to figure out how to use our technology wisely.
Yes.
Josh, I heard you use the term blind chance.
Yes.
And I would love for you to talk about that in the context of what I've been reading a great deal about, which is self-organizing dynamics.
Oh.
At the bottom.
This is a graduate level question here.
I warned them. Or them trying to answer them, but I'm sure he'll kind of try to keep it LA level.
I promised Fran I'd leave the differential equations back in the lab. When I mentioned blind chance, I was talking about evolution, and evolution is not just blind chance. It is many things, but there is an important random element to evolution, as we know. Modern evolutionary theory tells us also that there is a component of self-organizing systems, which is that evolution is not working with just independent pieces and trying to tinker and put them together, that biological components like cells and organs and systems tend to self-organize. If you put together cells in a certain way, just because of the physics of the cells, they'll flatten into a sheet or roll up into a hollow sphere. And evolution, it seems, acts on that. It basically just exploits the fact that a lot of nature's building blocks tend to self-organize. I hope that helps. There's many books on the subject.
All the way to the back?
So following on that, I wonder what kind of learning paradigms you have
Okay.
for organisms.
Okay.
Are they just introspective with trial and error, which are the examples you've been giving us? Or do they learn by observation or access to libraries and intranets that have been used?
Okay. In my lab, we do different sorts of mixtures. So sometimes we're just evolving our creatures so that these virtual creatures that evolved, they're basically just a bundle of instincts, right? If you tap your knee, your lower leg responds, right? There's no learning. They're hardwired to do whatever they do. In other cases, we evolve robots for the ability to learn. So evolution sets up the brains of these robots that when we then set them loose in a virtual environment or in the physical environment, they can start to learn. They can sort of push against the world and observe how the world pushes back and learn from that. And the building blocks, in order to do that, that's something that evolution sort of gives to these robots. So we also explore the interaction between evolution and learning.
Do you guys have one question each for each other?
I have a question for you.
Okay, go for it. We'll get back to the audience.
So in thinking with the glass ceiling,
okay,
beyond which so far things are not really evolving, in my head, you referenced how you've got 50 years, but nature's got 3.5 billion on this planet to figure some problems out. But it's not just 3.5 billion years, and we'll take for granted that there's not a god or gods directing it. We'll just assume that for the question. But that it's not just 3.5 billion years, it's also 3.5 billion years in an enormously complicated environment.
That's correct.
And so I'll do something I don't normally do and pretend like I'm Ray Kurzweil.
Okay.
And tell you that, well, the computers are getting so much better.
Right.
Constant growth curve, exponential, it's all wonderful. What about the day when you're able to simulate a much, much more complicated environment than the one at present? Do you think that in and of itself would suffice to solve your problem?
So as a scientist, I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. Necessary meaning we're never going to get beyond this complex ceiling until we have much, much more powerful computers, as you mentioned, and able to simulate much more realistic environments. I think that's a part of it, but there's an intellectual part that's still missing, is that we still don't understand the brain. We also still don't understand evolution. We're not simulating or we're not replaying evolution in the right way. There is a lot of interesting stuff happening in the field of evolutionary theory, and we're missing all of that stuff. Evolution is not just a matter of enough space and enough time. There are certain things that have to be in place in order for more and more complexity to evolve, and that's where the research is, trying to find those missing pieces. I have a question back for you. Again, from Moravec, I've known about the singularity, the idea for a long time, and it seems that, at least in theory, it's possible. Do you think that the singularity is inevitable?
No, I certainly don't. For me, the singularity is a religious concept, though not a technological one.
Okay.
And people in the Western traditions have been talking about the apocalypse for a couple thousand years now, and they're always talking about how it's a couple years away.
Right.
Inevitably, it's my lifetime. In my lifetime, I'm going to get it.
Right.
And that goes all the way back. You can find it in the apocalyptic text of the Jewish tradition, the apocalyptic text of the Christian tradition. We want it now, not 1,000 years from now. And Ray Kurzweil also, he is the author of How to Live Long Enough to Live Forever. So he is again committed to the in my lifetime.
Right.
All I got to do is stick it out 15 more years. In 2029, I think is the current guess for when the robots are going to get really, really smart. And shortly after that, we'll be uploading our minds into them.
2029.
So there's your date. There's your benchmark.
Okay.
You got to
tell my grad students.
Hans Moravec has revised.
Okay.
Hans Moravec's current number is 2039.
Oh, okay.
But depending on who you believe.
Right.
So I don't think it's inevitable, especially because we could all kill ourselves before 2029. I'd say that's at least as likely as a transcendent technological moment of evolution. Right. At least as likely.
Okay, are we good for a few more minutes? We've got about an hour. Feels everybody okay? Yes, Mr. Wright, in the back.
You started the conversation by saying that some people are afraid of robots and others are comfortable with them. It leads me to think about the human mind and gifted people, like Einstein or Steve Jobs. of inventing, and I think that tells a lot about how a gifted person thinks and how the rest of us don't think. We don't even suspect. And I just wanted to ask where you think all this is going, because personally, having been exposed to a gifted person, I feel quite comfortable accepting that gifted people think differently, and I have no thoughts of ever being able to go beyond not suspecting, so to speak. And I think the fear of robots may be thinking here is that, well, maybe they're going to get into what Edison and Steve Jobs and doing things that the rest of us don't understand. They have no idea why they're making those decisions. Is that, do you think robots could potentially go to that level of a gifted mind? And is that, where would that take us?
Yeah, there's a lot of, in the writing, fear of robots when they become more intelligent than us.
Yeah.
Robots will certainly be, machines in general, will certainly be able to solve certain kinds of problems that human beings just can't solve. That's already the case. If they solved a whole range of problems that we can't solve, then I expect that might be a bit intimidating, but I think most people would kind of welcome it, especially insofar as you're able to integrate that machine into your life. You know, you look at things like cell phones, and I confess to not liking cell phones. I have one only because my wife makes me. They allow you to do a lot of different kinds of things that you couldn't have done before, and they give you senses of security in various kinds of ways that you didn't have before. And if you have a really fancy one, they help you learn and know things that you couldn't have learned and known before, at least not in the moment of the use of the phone. You know, so your ability to integrate it into your life matters enormously. And, you know, of course, someone like Ray Kurzweil would tell you, well, it's not just that machines are getting a lot better, it's that we're learning a lot more about brains too. And just wait till we hook your brain up to the machine. You're not going to have to be scared of whether the machine is more gifted than you, because it's going to be you. And then there's nothing to be afraid of anymore. Of course, that causes other people to be afraid. And they're like, well, that's, you know, no, what a horrific future where we're all cyborgs and, you know, but we all seem to be sliding into that route. Whether we're really going to be able to connect machines to our brains to allow us to have perpetual access to the internet and whatever else, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows that, but it seems fundamentally possible. And we'll slide there. You know, if somebody invented that tomorrow, like, look, here, it's a box, and you're going to wear it right here, and it's going to connect to your brain, you know, through a little plug in the side of your head, and then you're going to know all these wonderful new things. Then we'd all freak out, and there'd be widespread panic. But if the phones just keep getting better and better and better, then it won't, you know, it's not such a panic-inducing kind of feeling.
One thing I took away from your question is the fear associated with incomprehensibility, right? So I remember as a kid, you know, with kits and with computers actually, is that you could understand the computer all the way down to the transistor, and anything that the computer did, you could, if you spent enough time, you could actually understand how it works. As a society, we're now producing technologies where no one person can tell you exactly how that machine works. They know how this part works, and this person knows how this person works. And we are crossing this line now in our society where we're allowing those technologies to fly our planes, to make military decisions, where it's a technology that's literally incomprehensible, where one person can't defend why this machine made that decision. We don't need autonomous robots to cross that line. We're already crossing it, and I think that is one of the most meaningful lines that our society is crossing. And how do we feel as a culture to accept these technologies into our midst? And is it inevitable? You know, is there a way to stop that and put something in place where we say we will not rely on technology unless we can understand that technology all the way down to the electron and really understand how it made the decision that it did?
And is it going to follow Asimov's rules of being a good robot?
Yeah.
John?
You were talking about your ideas running out of gas when you were running through things.
Yeah.
When I run into those kinds of situations in real life, I go and talk to my friends who are bipolar. And we usually come up with solutions that I can talk about.
Okay.
Do you have any bipolar robots?
I've got lots of bipolar colleagues. Faculty members, there is no shortage of whatever mental pathology you can think of, it's there.
Or do you go and just feed out things that just, aren't doing what you want? Like, you shut them off because like the first robot you talked about that just ran away.
Right.
It was unplaying itself, so therefore you didn't use that one anymore.
That's right. Well, I don't know. I interpret your question as, where do you go for inspiration, or where do you go when you get stuck? And for any, is that?
Well, I was just wondering if you had robots that were doing things that you weren't expecting, and maybe you should let them go for a little bit.
Oh yes, yeah. So that is a huge part of our research, which is balancing exploration, meaning let the computer try things that at least seem silly, but given enough time, they will evolve into something that's useful. Exploration versus exploitation, which means this robot at least is exhibiting the rudiments of the behavior you want, so let's focus more of our attention on that. So that's this balancing thing, which as creative people we do all the time. How long should I pursue this seemingly crazy idea, but my gut tells me there's something there. Yeah, it's a difficult, obviously, balance to make.
That'll limit us to about 2 more questions. Yes, 2 or 3.
I'm kind of struck by the labels of some of these things, like to attribute a robot's decision as a decision or a behavior.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, or you mentioned the starfish, a god, being a god, we're giving them these labels, and I'm wondering if there is going to be another language that will be describing these things to kind of remove it from the human element.
Yes, from being anthropomorphized in some way. Can we get out of ourselves almost?
Can we get out of our own language enough to do that? I don't know if I'm explaining that very well.
I wonder whether we would really want to. I'd rather the technology be humanized. Because I think if we can't humanize the technology, we can't use it humanely. And at the moment we start talking about it computed blank, then I would, all this, and perhaps this just has something to do with the way I think and my background, but I start thinking about, say, Nazi Germany and getting people to places where they were going to die. And the individual people who are putting people on trains, or the individual people who are building this or that or whatever else, having an inhumane technology for death, and if they actually thought of those as trains for sending people to die, that train's killing those people. That train is taking them, it's a murdering train. Then maybe they wouldn't have felt so good about using the trains that way. And so while I don't know, I guess I feel pretty good about people thinking about robots as he's and she's and doing things kind of like us, because I hope that will help us avoid some of our very worst habits.
Right here in the black, yes.
I just had a question going back to the idea of downloading human consciousness and transhumanism and maybe the work of Martin Rothblatt and the terrorism movement. And I was just curious if you felt like it was worth exploring, not so much, I think that when people initially, history's full of scientific ideas just being laughed at initially. And I think that when you initially think of it, you think of rich guys whose heads are stored in cryogenic labs and want to live forever. But if you're actually thinking about replicating a brilliant mind and having 10 people who think like Isaac Newton, what would the world be like? Do you think it's worth exploring?
And I'm sorry, could you guys try to repeat the question for people? I'm sorry I hadn't done that earlier. And then answer it.
So the Terrasem Foundation is right now a kind of major player in transhumanism, and it's interesting that you raise the idea of someone's head in a vat or whatever, since one of the things that Martine Rothblatt is doing is trying to copy her partner's mind, and there's a little robot head, and it can have conversations. Is it worth exploring? I sure think so. Why would we want to not explore anything that strikes us as interesting? So if it's plausible to copy a personality, I think people are going to do it anyway, and that it would be interesting enough to give it a go. And I would just again, encourage that we do that in the most humane way possible. You know, I mean, frequently people say something like, yeah, it'd be great to have 10 Einsteins, but what if you had 10 Hitlers, or Hitler never died? And I'm like, I don't know why anybody would go to the trouble of trying to, you know, copy the mind of Hitler or what have you. It strikes me as a bizarre project that very few people would really be invested in, and that many of us might benefit from, you know, a kind of mind copying thing. We can give it a shot. I mean, I don't know whether the Terrasem approach is going to work. They have websites, you can go to them, you can answer a whole battery of questions about your personality, and the assumption is something like if they asked enough questions and the questions were good enough, that the computer could calculate your personality and basically mimic what you would answer to other questions that you've never answered. Is that really possible? I don't know, but it sure seems worth finding out.
Well, it takes us that whole immortality question as well that consumes many people.
Yeah, I still don't think it's going to help you if you're dying. You know, I honestly, even if the robot version of you is a wonderful replica of you, when you're actually dying, I don't see that really being a great consolation unless you have small children who need to be cared for or something like that. You know, and you could go, oh, well, at least the robot me can keep doing my job, and the kids will, you know, have a place to live, and they can talk to someone who's a heck of a lot like me when they have problems or something. But aside from that scenario, I don't personally think it's going to be all that consoling, because I don't really look forward to dying.
We're going to take one more question, and fortunately, both Robert and Josh are going to stay here afterwards. Yes, you've been patient.
I'm kind of looking back to something that you said earlier, an irrational cold judgment that we all like to have. Some of us don't like to have rational cold.
That is a good point, yes.
So my question would lean more toward the creative side of things. You've just spoken to the rational and you've spoken to the emotional. But I'm wondering what you're seeing in creativity that's coming from your research and the robots you're building. If they can recognize, even from a painterly aspect, the blue and purple, could they become an impressionist? Could they become the next whatever happens in art or whatever? Can they access human creativity?
This is about how can we access human creativity through your study of robotics?
At least I view a lot of the products of evolution in my lab as creative output, but that's creative from an unconscious process, which is the process of natural selection. And my robots are not sophisticated enough to be exhibiting creativity. They're running around or distinguishing between objects. There are some robotics projects where you have robot painters and robot dancers. And again, it challenges us to confront the question, what does it... Speaking of adaptive behavior.
I'm all wired in myself here. Almost, it knew it was time to finish.
It's the only way to get us to stop talking.
It's amazing how this equipment, this technology...
My students wish they had one of those.
So you get a robot to do this?
If a robot paints a picture, is the robot being creative? You know, how do we know, right? And it's an interesting question to think about.
I think we should move on. I just do have to tease one thing that we didn't get to with Robert. His new project is about craft, which just seems so old-fashioned and quaint in comparison to what you've been doing in this return to the basics and how that might satisfy a yearning for meaning. So I can't thank you both enough. This has been mind-expanding, I think, for all of us. We thank you for spending a few minutes. We hope that you join us in a room right over here, in this incredible space. We want to thank the Shelburne Museum and Shelburne Farms and, of course, All Souls for putting these together. I hope you join me next week when you will meet a robot. Aubrey Schick will be with us. She creates robots that help with autistic children, with the elderly. She's really working with how robots can help us in everyday life. Fascinating person, and that was actually brought up, the Carnegie Mellon Institute of Robotics, I believe is what it is called. So again, Josh Bongard and Robert Geraci, thank you so much for being here today and joining us.
Thank you guys for coming.